Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to this Innovation Forum webinar. I'm Ian Welch and I'll be your host for the next hour or so. We're going to be looking at how technology and data can help us build more sustainable agricultural supply chains. Food and agriculture sectors are facing more and more pressing and interconnected challenges in their ability to feed the world, for sure. But advances in data and technology are tools that help transform how farmers grow and produce food through sustainable and regenerative practices. And to discuss this for the next hour, we have an excellent panel. We have Alison Kopp from Tract, we have Joanna Hazel-Fowler from Nestle, and Matt Wood from Cargill. And our thanks to Cargill for sponsoring this discussion. Now, I'll be turning to our panelists shortly, but we do want to hear from you all. So please be thinking about points and questions that you'd like me to put to the panel and write them in the Q&A box on your Zoom window. You can, of course, like others' questions, and the more upvotes any question gets, the greater are the chances that I will put that question to the panel. Please keep your questions short and do add your name and organisation so we know who you are. Okay, welcome all. Matt, let me turn to you. Perhaps you can start by giving us some context on how Cargill has developed transparency tools. Matt.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Ian. At Cargill, we really believe that transparency is how we build trust in the food and agriculture system, and trust is critical. We have been working on transparency solutions for a number of years now. One exciting example that we really started with was sharing one-to-one with our customers. We would often receive requests from customers asking for information about where the crops we originate come from, how they move through the supply chain, how they ultimately end up with our customers. So we started developing what we call our WISE suite of products. And there's kind of a fun origin story about our WISE suite of products. Early days when we were sharing this information with customers, it was very sort of ad hoc spreadsheets, PDFs, PowerPoints, that type of thing. And Cargill annually, we host what we call a data challenge, where employees are invited to develop their own solutions. And our first product around this actually originated from one of these data challenges. A team of employees built a first prototype of our PalmWise platform. That's now grown to, we have PalmWise and SoyWise and CocoWise across those solutions. So those have been out for a number of years, and we've received some really positive feedback from customers. But what we ultimately have started to hear is that as the need for this information has increased and the volume of requests has increased from customers and suppliers, that many of our competitors and other industry bodies have also developed similar solutions. And this creates a challenge for customers where how do you compare information you receive from one customer to another when companies are using different methodologies? So we joined with some of our peers in the market to develop Tract, and I won't talk too much about Tract. Alison is here, but we are starting to look at how we can drive efficiency in how we share that information, and really to compete around the substance of our products. We believe we can make and sell the most sustainable products in the market, and not compete on the math or the how of sustainability. So that's a really exciting thing for us. And ultimately, if we can lower the cost of transparency and increase efficiency, it allows us to invest more time, more of our energy in where it really matters, which is driving down impact and having more sustainable products.
Okay. Can you give us a bit of a kind of journey there? I've used the word journey word already. In terms of how technology has evolved to address challenges in supply chains and in agriculture?
Yeah, it has been a whirlwind. The pace of transformation in technology is really, really remarkable. Since the early 2000s, Cargill has been investing in geoanalytics and sustainability, satellite imagery as part of our core business. Initially, it was to understand weather patterns, to understand supply chain dynamics, those types of things. And as we started to want to use digital tools to strengthen our sustainability performance, it was natural that we would build on those capabilities that we had. But what we've seen is the cost of remote sensing, the cost of satellite imagery has come down exponentially since the early 2000s. Initially, it was really only the largest companies could have access, and it's really been democratized where it's quite easy to get access to that, which we think was really great. It increases transparency across the overall supply chain and enables some really innovative things. The technology has also advanced significantly where early days you could see it sort of coarse resolution, and now it seems like daily we're seeing new announcements from different companies increasing the resolution of visibility, using machine learning and AI to increase that. We're talking a lot about transparency, but it's important to note that transparency is just one piece of that puzzle. We use technology to work with the farmers that we source from to help to drive practices that might reduce the impact of the products, to trace products through our supply chain, and then ultimately share that information with our customers.
I'm sorry, to touch on mute. It's only taken 5 minutes. Okay, can you give us some examples of the sort of improvements that machine learning and AI can provide then?
Sure. Yeah. So on the farmer side, we are using advanced technologies to actually predict where there might be more sustainable practices. So computer vision is one of those technologies that we utilize. So we can now we'll partner with farms, and we can detect if they have cover crops, for example, which is one of the practices that in row crops can actually help to keep more carbon in the soil, increase soil health. So we can detect what types of crops are being grown. If they have these regen ag practices going on, we can detect tillage practices using computer vision technologies. Whereas in the past, that would have been, humans going out to the farm to really monitor that. And then on the other side, land use change and conversion is tremendously important, and we use similar techniques to alert us to if there may be land use change occurring in areas that we source from.
So I guess that in many respects, there's a big role that technology has to play in developing transparency and accountability in supply chain. So overall, it's a solution, or is it just an enabler?
Yeah, it's funny. In the role I'm in, I think you'd probably expect me to say it's the solution, but I think of technology and data analytics as really the enabler. You'll see lots of advertisements for companies out there and solutions that sort of present themselves as the silver bullet, and really without action, all the technology, all the transparency in the world is not going to get us to where we need to be. To keep the world to 1.5 degrees Celsius, and it takes real action on the ground in the supply chain, and that's Cargill. We're at the center of the food and ag industry, and that's where we put a lot of our focus, is working with farmers and ranchers around the world to use technology to help to drive those efficiencies that we need to see.
Okay, great. Thanks, Matt. Lots to come back on there. I should have said at the start that we are, of course, recording the webinar. So we will be sharing that recording with everybody who registered, so you can listen again or share with your colleagues. So in answer to a couple of people who've asked about this, yeah, we are recording the webinar. Anyway, Matt, thank you. Joanna, let me turn to you. For you then, what are the main challenges associated with data sharing in agricultural supply chains?
Yeah, so in my role, obviously, I'm a real advocate for data sharing in supply chains because it helps us really identify relevant actions on important topics such as emissions reduction, um, and responsible sourcing, as Matt highlighted. But there are some challenges that are innate with agricultural supply chains. First of all, they're quite complex, or they can be quite complex. If you take an example of a spices supply chain, for example, it can be processed multiple times on its way from the farm to the factory, and it can change hands many times. So there's that complexity of the transparency that's the first challenge. Second, I think there's all types of parties involved in the supply chain. Smallholders remain really important, but there's parties of all sizes with different levels of digital capability. And it's that digitization of information that's really important to help enable the data sharing. And then finally, I think each party often has a different name for the same thing. If you think about cocoa, we might refer to cocoa liquor, cocoa bean, cocoa butter, but Matt or somebody else might call it something different. And so the other part of the challenge is the fact that we need to all talk the same language to enable this data sharing.
And what are the how do you get around that then? Because obviously everybody develops ways of seeing things the way they want to see them. How have you found, how have you found it possible to get across that to everyone else and try to find collaboration in that area?
Yeah, I think there are some valuable areas where we can collaborate. So first of all, on naming and on data standards, so that we are talking the same language. There's a couple of examples, such as GS1's work on location data standards. There's some initiatives ongoing through WBCSD to align on data standards for product carbon footprint, and maybe Alison will share a bit more on some in her area as well. But I think getting us all talking the same language, following common data standards, is a big enabler. And then on top of that, it enables us to use technology more effectively to share the data and share the information. And that can be through a common platform, or I think in the future, we're also going to see data sharing through industry networks, where if we're using common data standards, we can exchange system to system across the industry, and it will be much more efficient than this one-on-one approach that Matt talked about that we're doing today. But I think a really important consideration is digital inclusion, because I mentioned many of the parties are smallholders, and there's organizations of all different sizes. So I think that's something else that we need to keep in mind to design our approaches in the industry for everyone.
Do you think that to come back to something that Matt brought up, there's going to be a role for AI in developing these industry networks and sharing system to system?
Yeah, I think we see a role already for AI in maintaining data quality in particular. So to help us identify outliers, help us manage the quality of the data internally and that which is being exchanged. So yeah, I think there's definitely a role there to supplement what our teams are doing. Yeah.
Okay, so what are the benefits then of doing this? I mean, there's clearly significant challenges in bringing all this together, but there must be some benefits.
So I think aligning data standards and working out effective ways of collaboration helps us exchange data in a really timely manner. And Matt gave one example of responding to deforestation alerts. I think that's something where we can work in collaboration with upstream and downstream parties in the value chain to respond quickly if information is shared on a timely basis. I also think it really helps identify relevant action. So, for example, in Nestle, where we're working to decarbonize the dairy value chain and our dairy ingredients, where we can get primary data from suppliers about how that dairy is produced, exactly the origin of where it's coming from, then we can identify relevant projects that we can do in collaboration with suppliers that suit the farmers in those locations. And what's done in a pasture-based dairy environment such as New Zealand would be different to what's done in a smallholder farm in India. So having that primary data shared, really understanding the origin and the production methods really helps tailor the support that's provided, and the farmers then access more relevant support as a result of that data sharing. And I think there's lots of examples like that where sharing data across the supply chain helps us collaborate on relevant projects and provide relevant support to each other. Yeah.
So I guess in some respects, the sharing of the data and trying to bring data that's more homogenized then allows very specific support in different geographies.
Yeah, that's right. So another example is if we know the origin of the ingredient. So if you know, as Matt shared, we can obtain transparency information, so we know exactly the origin of where an ingredient is produced, then that helps us together manage risk, but also identify relevant landscape projects. For example, where we can support the adoption of regenerative agriculture into those landscape areas where these ingredients are coming from. Yeah.
Okay, well, thanks, John. Again, lots we can come back on there as well. Alison, let me turn to you. Welcome. Why don't you just give us a very quick 2-sentence introduction to Tract? Some of us on the call may not have heard too much about you.
Yeah, sure. Tract, and Matt alluded to this. We're a joint venture between players in the industry, so Cargill, Olam, ADM, and Louis Dreyfus, and we're set up really to tackle two things. One is the challenge that Joanna just talked about, Matt just talked about, around aligning the industry around the methodologies and metrics that we're all talking about here, whether it's carbon, deforestation, social risk, right? All of the different types of things that make up our programmatic sustainability investment. And then two is to build the technology that allows the folks in the supply chain to track and share that information in a way that helps you achieve your business goals.
Great, well, thank you. Okay, I'd like to talk a little bit about regulation. Clearly, that's driving a lot of the running here in this for sure. Particular, something that we talked about quite a lot at Innovation Forum, the EU deforestation regulation. How do you see, Alison, that affecting data sharing practices and collection in supply chains?
Yeah, it's a great question. So it's the hot topic of the day right now is EUDR, right? And fundamentally, one of the most interesting things about the regulation from a data perspective is that it's creating a new paradigm for data sharing, because it's mandating that we have to share certain pieces of information through the supply chain that perhaps before we weren't sharing unless there was a real reason to, right? And some of those pieces of information are still things that are tricky to share, right? Because either they're tricky to collect, they're tricky to analyze, they're tricky to share for whatever reason, right? Polygon data is a classic example of this. At the last Innovation Forum event here in Amsterdam, I asked the audience how many people in the room felt like they had 100% coverage of Polygon data, and 0 people raised their hand, right? And that's just the state of data collection. Now you add in data sharing, you add in security, you add in IP concerns, you add in, right? There's a lot of really interesting challenges when it comes to sharing information in a regulatory environment. Sorry if you hear the ambulance in the background. This is the middle of Amsterdam in the summer. And so it's not as easy as we maybe like to think that it is to share this information in the supply chain. And there's real concerns there too, right? And so, but because of this, they're creating a new layer of a foundation that actually does bring forth this new era of transparency that is mandated. Why that's really interesting is we can now start to really fundamentally map an aligned approach to traceability in the industry. Add deforestation, which becomes a great sustainability topic to start thinking about, and we can start to build from there. Now we can start to think about carbon, we can start to think about living income, we can start to think about forced labor, right? There are things that we can kind of keep building on top of this, which is really interesting.
Okay, do you have any specific concerns then around greenwashing? Because obviously another area, whenever there's this sort of regulation coming in that requires more data sharing, there's always concerns around greenwashing, and then perhaps protection of IP when sharing data.
Yeah, so I'll talk a little bit about, so on the greenwashing side, I may actually weave in an answer to your question to Matt and Joanna about AI, because I think this is actually one of the more practical applications for AI in this space. And I came from a computer vision company previously that was focused on full kind of automation of data collection. And so there's a lot of opportunities for AI in the data collection side, but there's also a really practical application from a verification validation side. So when we're talking is these massive data sets, you can start to do really mathematical modeling for pattern recognition and these types of things to understand, is the data what the data should be? Is that polygon where it should be located? Is the supply chain volume matching what it should be, right? There are things you can do from a validation of data perspective that are really interesting, both from a mathematical standpoint, but also from an AI tool perspective. You can apply different models. So I think there's a really interesting application there from a validation standpoint. And that ties into the greenwashing side, because really what we're talking about here is how do you prove what you're doing, right? How do you prove the validity in the information that you're providing? And so the first step to that is proper data sharing methods, proper data collection methods, then proper data sharing methods. And then the second piece is the validation verification side of things. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there from a technology perspective to help the folks in the supply chain to ensure that we're not just compliant with the regulation, but that we're really doing what we say we're going to do. On the IP side, though, that you did touch on there, that is really, really interesting, because we're talking about a lot of data pieces that are really fundamentally pieces of IP to most businesses, and have been, and are now being peeled back as something that has to be shared. And so something that maybe previously would have enabled a premium, for example, is now something that's mandated to be shared. And that's where we're going to start to see, or already are seeing, different interpretations of the regulation, and that's where alignment can be really powerful. So I think, Joanna was starting to hit on this, but that's where we can really, by bringing the industry together to work on this, we can create alignment and start to kind of peel back the layers on that.
So how can data be protected then, whilst it's also being shared? What's the sort of secret formula there?
Yeah, there's actually a few different approaches. So this is a fun one on the technology side that we can get into, but there are lots of ways to protect data, and there's the security side of protection, right? So there's the first and foremost, how do we make sure that information is protected and is essentially zero risk as it moves through the supply chain, which is its own unique challenge. But I think the interesting thing here is, how do you share information that you don't want to share with partners in a trusted way that proves it's there? Like, because that's really fundamentally what we're talking about. And that's a really interesting technological challenge to solve. And there are a few different ways to solve that. There's encryption, right? You can send encrypted data that can be decrypted for whatever reason, maybe an audit or grievance, for example. You can share masked and unmasked data, which is somewhat similar, but it's viewable or unviewable depending on how it's there. So there's a few different data structures to this, but what we're doing at Tract is we're taking an approach that philosophically mirrors that, right? You send packages of information that are time-stamped and fully fully there, so that they can be proved back through the due diligence process, but that you can choose what somebody would actually view or not view. What that enables you to do is you can select the information you want your next person in the chain to have access to view, but it's all provable because it's time stamped in there, right? And uneditable. And so, and again, there's lots of different infrastructure. You can talk about blockchain and all these types of technologies to enable this, but it is possible. It's just an interesting technological challenge to solve for.
Thank you. Audience, do keep putting your questions into the Q&A box, and also use the upvote function. We'll be coming to those very shortly. Alison, I wonder if we could just change tack slightly. What steps do you think that the industry should be taking to prepare for compliance with EUDR? I mean, obviously it's coming in rapidly. What do you think should be happening to ensure compliance across value chains?
Yeah, I'll give two, hopefully really practical things. One is start now. We've seen a wide spectrum of readiness on data collection and data preparedness. And so, it may take you days, but it may take you months. And so you don't want to be starting this process in December. So start now, get protocols in place, understand where your data lives, what format that's in. There is a lot of data cleaning that has to happen. Make sure that your teams are just kind of brought into the process early. And the second one is align your IT your IT, your sustainability, your legal teams, whoever needs to be involved at your organizations to make sure that they're involved in the process, because like I said, there's also different interpretation internally. We find this all the time. I was joking internally at our organization the other day. We got into a debate about is something a model or is something a calculator, which is quite literally the same thing. But we're having this long debate about this, and just if we're having these mini teeny little language debates, imagine what we're having across the industry, right? So bring in the teams in your organization that need to be involved so that you can align internally around the data preparedness as well.
Okay. Ultimately then, what's your view on how regulation can drive positive change?
I think the Polygon data is a really good example of this. This is data that likely weren't collecting in completeness before, and now is fleshing out a new picture into what's happening on the farm, right? And so this is driving forward a new way of thinking about data collection, data sharing, transparency, traceability, in a way that forces our hand a little bit, right? And now we have to think about it, which is good, but it also, there's a lot of challenges in that, right? And so we can't ignore the challenges, I think, in setting up the IT infrastructure around alignment, around bringing smallholder farms to the table, right? There's just a lot. I mean, you think about data collection for Polygon data at the farm level in countries where technology is hard to access, and satellite imagery is not complete. Those are real challenges, and so it's a fast, accelerated timeline that we have to meet. So there's real practical challenges in doing that, but it also does set us up to have the conversation around what traceability and transparency means in our supply chains, which is a good thing.
Okay, thanks very much. Let's turn to some audience questions. Thanks very much. Keep them coming. Our most popular question so far is a good one, asking if smallholder farmers should get paid for data as a means to incentivize data collection through digital tools. Great question. Joanna, I wonder if you wanted to have a crack at that.
So I think what we're trying to do is support farmers to implement, for example, regenerative agriculture practices, to decarbonize, and that's really where the support is aimed. And I think part of that is sharing the data so that we can work together to make sure that things are moving in the right direction. So I think that's how we would frame the response to that question. And then from an IT perspective, in my role, we're just really working to enable that.
Because it comes down to collaboration as much as anything else. Perhaps not a direct transactional relationship here, but more a question of support to enable improvements that benefit everybody.
Yeah, but the data sharing is an important part of it, but the support is a broader support that the farmers are getting. Yeah.
Great, thanks, Joanna. Matt, do you want to comment on that one?
Yeah, I can. I totally would agree with what Joanna mentioned there. An area, though, in general, when we're talking about the why, previously I talked about really the why is to drive action. When we look at outcomes from this, that's where we really want to ensure there's value going back in the supply chain to the farmers that are critical to the food and agriculture industry. So we have a program in the US and Europe and starting up in Australia called Regen Connect, where we do just that. We will pay farmers for outcomes related to carbon sequestration in the soil or production of nitrogen from fertilizer. We have other programs related to other practices where we are directly paying farmers for those outcomes, and it's really important that the value is shared for those outcomes.
Okay, thanks, Matt. Alison, I wonder if you could respond to a question we've got related to EUDR, and it brings up a point that Joanna raised around there being supply chains where there are lots of actors. The product passes through many pairs of hands. The question is asking about coffee sector and EUDR compliance. With that complexity of the supply chain, Alison, what do you think in terms of, are there any ways on ensuring accuracy of data provided by upstream actors, apart from going to audits? And what other tools can be used to ensure the accuracy of data?
Yeah, this is a good question, because it's tricky, right? Especially if people are kind of hidden intermediaries, which I think is probably what this is hinting at a little bit, right? Which is all too common. The first thing is ensuring that there is good linking logic between how to define a supply chain. I would say, like, from a data perspective, this is maybe fundamental. But understanding that point A goes to point B, goes to point C and D is really critical for the supply chain, because then you can understand at least where maybe B and C are missing data or something like this. So if you're trying to identify missing data, there's ways on a logic basis you can do this by having proper linking logic in your supply chain. And understanding that at least you have gaps, and that it's hard to do, but you can, and that's through definition. Then if you have the challenge of ensuring that data is clean, I think this is where mathematical modeling comes in handy, and having access to broad data sets is really helpful, right? Because if you can identify sort of pattern recognition that something is off, you can do that a lot easier if you have consistency of data in your supply chain, and you have the ability to look at broader data sets. And that's where, when you're an independent company like Tract, in kind of the middle here, is it from a technology perspective is really powerful, because we can do that. Like, we can train models like that, and start to understand patterns independent of the data, right? And so I think there's a lot of value that can be provided there potentially, based on that, to at least understand where there might be clean or unclean data. But I think the third one is actually non-technological, which is you have to make sure incentives are aligned, right? It's that show me the incentive, I'll show you the outcome piece. And so we have to make sure incentives are aligned in the industry, because if there's an incentive to put good data in, then there is an incentive to then you'll have good data, right? If there's an incentive to put data in, you'll have data. So what's the reason and rationale for somebody to participate in the world of traceability is a really interesting question that I'm not qualified to answer, but I put back to the industry to maybe think about, right?
Thank you. I mean, Joanna, you mentioned this earlier in relation to the spice supply chain. Do you have any further comments on Alison's response there?
Just it continues to be a challenge. We do need to motivate everybody in the upstream value chain to share data and be transparent and build capability to do that. But as I said, also make it easy to do it as well, remembering that some of these parties involved are very, very small players. So finding simple ways to digitize a record of a transaction, I think, is really, really important. So I think it's a common challenge that we're all working on, to try and bring visibility of all of these processing nodes that we need to, where we need to drive the effort on responsible sourcing and sustainability. Yeah, it's a common challenge.
I guess that means when you've got these small players, is being able to have solutions that can work with what they have. I mean, maybe they have a simple mobile phone. So what kind of solution would work with that sort of technology? I guess that's the challenge that you face with these very small producers.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So in our value chain, an example we have is agronomists who visit farms where connectivity in remote regions can be really poor. And so we've had to think about equipping them with solutions that can work offline, so that they can still work even when they don't have the internet connectivity. And I think it's the same for all of these nodes in the value chain. We work with suppliers, they're working with their suppliers. We need to think about making it easy to digitize and collect this information.
So collect in field, store it offline, and then upload whenever you get to somewhere where you have a signal.
Yep.
Okay. Thank you. Another question that most popular question we have is answering around, again, data security. So for smallholder farmers in particular, how do organizations such as yours assure that transparency is not being used to the disadvantage of growers, and also ensuring that the information flows upwards as well as downwards? Matt, do you want to answer that one?
Yeah, I think about that in a couple of ways. So first off, without farmers, smallholders to large farmers being successful, Cargill won't be successful. Our customers won't be successful. They are the heart of the food and agriculture industry, and that is a core piece of the culture here at Cargill. In fact, when we talk about farmers, we refer to them as our customers internally, because there is a strong ethos that we serve the farmers. And that means, I talked about Regen Connect. That's one of the reasons why we designed the program the way that we did, in a way that really drives the value to those farmers. When it comes to data in particular, agronomy is one area where we provide those services back to farmers through the data. We are extremely clear and transparent about how the data is used, where it goes, and so forth. But ultimately, if there were to be a supplier in our supply chain that were found to be operating in an unsustainable way, it's important for us to know that and work with them to either to change those practices. That's an important part of this as well. So it has value across the board. I'll say in general, though, Cargill, we invest millions and millions every year in building schools in the supply chain, helping to increase the livelihoods of those suppliers that we source from. And beyond just the data, we take it extremely seriously that it's an important thing to make sure that those producers thrive.
Thank you, Matt. Joanna, you mentioned earlier the importance of data sharing. I guess that involves data sharing both ways, doesn't it?
Yeah, it definitely does. For those of us sat in the middle of this value chain, yes, we're starting to also, see the requests coming to us as well, and to have to think about what data standards to follow, what to prioritize, how to get ready, because indeed those upstream and downstream, everybody needs the data, because we're all trying to work on reducing emissions. Our scope 1 and 2 emissions are somebody else's scope 3 and vice versa. So yeah, it's data sharing both ways for sure. Yeah.
And are there any particular things to bear in mind when doing this? What are any kind of, the things that kind of must-dos?
Well, some of the things that I talked about earlier, making sure that we have a common language, I think is really important, so that we know what we're all talking about, we know the scope that we're talking about, we understand the methodology that each other is using, so that we can get the right insights out of the data, because ultimately the aim is to get the insights from it in order to drive relevant action, so that we don't spend the time handling the data, but spend the time and resources on having an impact and on taking action. So I do think having a common language, having data standards is probably one of the most important things.
Thank you very much indeed. Alison, I wonder if you could just take this on a little bit. We have another question asking about the role of companies in ensuring that data systems enable accountability and validation within the value chain. What for you are the key points that ensure that that's the case?
Yeah, I think it's really important. I mean, look, we're seeing, I was going to kind of hit on this in the last question, but there are unintended consequences of anything we do, right? Like the unintended negative consequences to shareholder farms, which I think is what a bunch of these questions are oriented around, is, we're going to make companies are going to make different sourcing decisions based on this information, because we're on an accelerated timeline to hit compliance. And because the compliance deadline is coming up soon, and contracts are already in motion, there will be some movement away from non-compliant locations, right? And so there are always going to be unintended consequences. Now, I think most of the companies in the supply chain want to work with the farmers, as Matt said, treat them as customers, right? Work with them. And Joanna was talking about the partnership that you have to have with smallholder farmers to invest in the programs that help the farmers, the farm communities really thrive. And so it's not hopefully a long-term thing, but there are always kind of unintended consequences. And so I think similarly with data, thinking about where in the value chain we can make sure that there's kind of positive impact. one of the interesting things that you can do when you think about a data sharing platform is enable the sharing kind of up and downstream, right? And so, we rely on data coming in at each step in the supply chain in order to get a complete picture of that supply chain at the end of the day. And what's interesting is sometimes even as you go further, into the supply chain, if you go further to the point of origin in the supply chain, they're not getting that complete picture. So, one of the things we could think about as an industry is how do we share that complete picture back so that farmers know where their product is going, right? Know what the impact of their product is so that we can measure the success of these programmatic investments that Joanna is mentioning, right? How do we think about using the information that we have to create a foundational set of information that the foundational language that we're all using to describe what sustainability success looks like in these programs is really an interesting opportunity from a data perspective, and making sure that the farmers are part of that, as well as everybody in the supply chain, frankly. We should all kind of understand what the impact of programmatic investment into different sustainability initiatives looks like and what that success looks like.
That's a great point, because I mean, so often we hear programs that allow consumers to see where products come from, but why not flip that on its head? Why not allow and incentivize and encourage farmers by saying, here's what you're producing, here's where it's going, here's what's happening to it. That's a really interesting. That really is truly connecting each end of the supply chain for sure. Question for you, Matt. I think it probably was prompted by something you said a little bit earlier about remote sensing. A questioner asks, what are the sort of protections available to farmers when it comes to data, specifically thinking about satellite data over farms? What protections are there? We're getting a lot of questions about data security today.
Yeah, it's good. I love it. Some jurisdictions, there are laws around the protection of data. Many jurisdictions have very robust laws, and those play a critical role in protecting users and how that information is shared, and that's a key part of it. As I mentioned a minute ago, Cargill, we're transparent with the suppliers that we purchase from and work with around these programs, with how we collect the information, what we do with it, and so forth. That transparency, we were talking about sharing information both ways. It's important that we're transparent in both directions as well with how we collect and use that information.
Thanks, Matt. Just moving a little bit along from that, again, a similar related question is actually put directly to you, Joanna, about Nestle, and how Nestle ensures the responsibility of data collecting and that isn't placed on producers by cooperatives, trader, exporters, but rather actually being supported. I guess it's down to another one of these too many hands in the process. And how do you ensure that the onus isn't all placed back onto the grower, as is so often the case here, or in the past rather?
For providing the data.
Yeah, I think that really the question is trying to get to the point, well, how do you ensure that it isn't another thing that's just slung on the another problem given to growers?
Yeah, I mean, I understand the concern behind the question, and typically what we're doing for the majority of our ingredients is working with our suppliers. So I think we also need maybe a little bit of perspective from Matt. And we talked about a number of the considerations about making it easy already. I think that's a digital inclusion, making it easy, keeping it simple is a big consideration for all of us. Matt, anything to add from your side?
Yeah, I love this question, and it's one that I often get on a soapbox about, because early on, when these types of programs started ramping up and supply chain sustainability started really accelerating, over the last 10 years, it started with surveys. That's where we started. Was I'm going to send a survey out to a supplier. Often it'll be the first tier supplier, and then that cascades its way down the supply chain. And ultimately, those surveys made their way to smallholder farmers in developing countries. And what we heard, and actually still continue to hear, is it's an incredible burden on those farmers to track and manage this information, to collect it and share it back, and it adds to the overall cost of their operations. Balancing that with the need for transparency and traceability is something that we've spent a lot of time thinking about, and we, technology has a role to play here. Remote sensing actually can help to reduce that overall survey fatigue that many suppliers feel, where if we can detect what's happening on the farm remotely, it can reduce that. Allison mentioned modeling. Modeling is another area where you can use models to understand where risk might be, to make sure you're pinpointing those questions where they absolutely need to be, or sampling where maybe you can go out to a farm and sample in a particular way so that it reduces that burden. But Carl, we source from millions of farmers around the world, and if you think about the idea of collecting primary data from all millions of those farmers, it would be a tremendous lift. And so something we're working with our stakeholders is to understand, where does that make sense? Where do we really need to work with those farmers on that primary data collection, and where can we use some of these more advanced techniques to reduce that burden?
Can I maybe just, oh, sorry, go ahead, Joanna.
Joanna, come in, please. And then
I would agree with a lot of what Matt said, and we do see the kind of evolving opportunities of remote technology to help supplement that which is needed to be collected on the ground and potentially reduce the burden. Yeah, I think that's an area that's going to evolve very quickly.
And I guess there's also a burden in those crunching the numbers. If you've got data from millions of farms, that's quite a burden as well. Alison.
I was just going to say also, I think this is a really big opportunity, frankly. So if folks are on this call and are like in technology but interested in this, there are also low-tech solutions that are really interesting. Like Matt hinted at surveys, which is not necessarily technology, but it is, right? Like it's a data collection method, and people hate on spreadsheets all the time. Spreadsheets are really great for a lot of reasons. And so then it becomes like, what's an interesting way to incorporate, instead of thinking about mobile applications, how do you think about, like, what kind of phones do people on the farm actually have, right? And it's just an interesting opportunity to think about the data collection problem and how to use low-tech solutions coupled with high-tech solutions to get to more of a complete picture, so that we're talking about accessibility fundamentally.
Thank you. Somebody's raised the B word, blockchain. It used to be that was the answer to all our problems, but someone has raised the question here. So Alison, what is the use of blockchain here? Can blockchain type technologies be useful?
Yeah, it can be. This is like, usually Matt has his soapbox, like blockchain tends to be my soapbox about how it's just not necessary in 90% of the cases that we're talking about. But blockchain is really helpful if you're thinking about distrust in an ecosystem, and there is distrust to some degree in some of the parties in the ecosystem here, but you can also have trust in a technology platform, depending on how it's built, right? And so, do you need a distributed ledger? Not necessarily, but can you use a chain of blocks? Sure, right? And like, doesn't have to necessarily be a distributed ledger to have meaning there. And so I think there are interesting applications that come from the world of blockchain that could be applied to traceability always. Does it have to be the solution? Absolutely not. There are absolutely other scalable ways to do this, and especially in a cost-effective manner, that make a lot more sense.
Joanna, I wondered, if someone sitting in the middle, as you said, of data going one way and data going the other way, do you think that there's still potential for blockchain type technology here?
Do you know, I think what was interesting about blockchain, and like everyone probably, we've tried it, I've tried it, it's the immutability. It's the fact that once a record is made, you can trust it because it can't be changed. And I think, as Alison said, there's other ways of achieving that and getting that benefit for the purpose of traceability and transparency. So I think it's one tool in the toolbox, but the most attractive thing about it is that kind of fraud-proof permanent record of a transaction that you can trust. And there's definitely other ways of achieving that. And yeah, that's what's beneficial, I think.
Thank you. Alison, I want to put a specific question to you. Someone's asked about the sort of social and human rights type data that's being built into Track. I think it's always very easy to get focused entirely on carbon environmental issues. So how do you ensure that focus is kept on the social and human rights side?
Love this. We have spent a lot of time on the human rights side and the social risk side. And I don't know if we can share resources again afterwards, but I'm happy to share. For example, we just wrote a paper on the partnership we have with Wageningen here in the Netherlands, where we're part of a public-private partnership to align around specific risk factors for EUDR, specifically child labor, forced labor, for example. So we've got different metrics for 45 different commodity and country combos for those two metrics, but we've got another 22 other metrics in the works here around human rights specifically and social risk. So I'm happy to share that methodology paper so folks can see how we're approaching that as well.
Yes, please do. We can certainly share that post-webinar for sure. But a question, I quite like this question, talking about how you develop system sustainability or knowledge of system sustainability. We talked about lots of individual things, lots of individual projects and ways of finding individual supply chains and measuring them and looking at that. But how do you quantify it collectively? How do you bring together knowledge or gain knowledge of entire system sustainability? Matt, do you want to go with that one?
That's a big question. So maybe I could ask you to elaborate. So are you asking sort of aggregate impact, how we look at that? Is that the core of your question?
Well, it's actually the core of Simon Cook's question, I'm hoping. Yeah, he's asking, can you envisage a time when you'll be able to identify how much more sustainable is the system you source from, and how definable is that? I guess it's a kind of bigger picture kind of thinking.
I see. Yeah, I mean, tracking progress is critical. In this space, it's easy to work really hard and not achieve a whole lot. That's probably the easiest thing to do. And so focusing your impact, your energy on those actions that have the most impact is really important. And the way you know that you're doing that is to track change over time. We as Cargill, obviously, as most large companies, we track our carbon footprint for our operations and our supply chain, and that's something we do and report on every year, so we can see that. It'll be interesting to see as track really starts to accelerate. They'll start to have sort of aggregate impact across the industry, and I think organizations like the Carbon Disclosure Project, et cetera, have for years been reporting impact in aggregate. I think it's really important. We need transformative sectoral change to get to where we need to be to address our global climate challenges and the other challenges that we face, and being transparent about the impact that we're having is critical for that.
Joanna, do you want to comment on that at all?
Nothing to add, Matt. I fully agree. Yeah.
Okay. Another question then. Obviously, a lot of this, I mean, Matt, you just mentioned just now that your Cargill sources from millions of farmers. So clearly, aggregating data is the only way you can get your head around the kind of picture. But is there a danger in doing that, or how do you avoid the danger of then losing the individual? So you inevitably have to aggregate to be able to deal with it, but then how do you ensure you don't lose track of the individual? I'd like perhaps Matt and all three to answer that one if you can.
Yeah, I mean, Allison was talking about the debates that they were just having internally, and this is one that we talk about a lot as well. We have programs that we are incredibly specific to certain elements of our supply chain where we're actually physically on farm with individual farmers, but then we have to zoom out and understand what the dynamics are across a global supply chain with billions of suppliers, like I said, and connecting those two together is incredibly hard and complex. And I can't sit here and say we've solved that completely, right? I don't think we have. And but it's a dynamic and a challenge that we need to pay attention to. And I think the the standards bodies that, whether it's World Resources Institute or, SBTI, the decisions that they're making now about how some of the protocols are being developed actually are incredibly meaningful in that, that you really want to make sure that when we talk about accounting for these impacts, that they focus on driving the right behaviors and driving the right action and impact that we need.
Sorry, talking my frog my throat. Joanna, do you want to comment any further on that? The kind of the challenge around aggregating to be able to deal with it versus the need to know the specific.
I think one of the tactics that we use as well is a bit of segmentation. So we really try and understand a segment of farms or suppliers really well, and we try and make sure we have relevant collaboration, relevant projects, relevant partnerships for that segment. And that helps us, I think, collaborate effectively and in a relevant way at a broader scale. So I think, there's different tactics here, and that's one of them that we use.
Alison, any comment on that?
Nothing really to add. I mean, we take a really similar approach to what Joanna is describing from a segmentation approach. So nothing necessarily to add. I think those are, yeah, that's great.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. We've had a lot of questions, and they will all be shared with our panelists. Our panel will see all the questions. If you've left your name and your question, I suspect it's possible for the panelists to respond to you directly if they wish to. So hopefully we'll have a bit more of that post-webinar. I'm conscious that we're coming towards the end of our time. I'm just going to ask each of the panelists to sum up. What are you taking away from the past hour, and what are you going to be looking for going forwards in terms of ensuring progress in all of this application of data? Joanna, do you go first?
Yeah, so I'm looking at our upstream supply chain and really inspired by a lot of the comments that Matt has shared today, and we just really encourage others involved as small, medium or large suppliers in the agri value chain to really work on data sharing and work on transparency and traceability, particularly for really important data like the origin of ingredients. That is a foundational piece of information that helps unlock a lot of collaboration in this area.
Thanks, Joanna. Alison?
Yeah, I think one of the things is that the partnership between the supply chain is so important, right? And I think that the collaboration, especially in a pre-competitive way, is really valuable. So hearing a lot of optimism around that, I think, is really exciting. And then the second one is about the involvement of shareholder farmers. Like, I think this, to me, was the pickup of this webinar, and so I'm interested to see, how we can continue to involve shareholder farmers into the process of traceability and make the system one that benefits everyone in it.
And on EUDR in particular, what do you need to see this year? We're now in May. We've got until December. What still needs to happen?
Oh, so much. so much. I would say one is, oh goodness. I mean, just speaking from a biased perspective of what we need to do, we're really focused on the data structure for data sharing and making sure that can be done in a scalable, secure way. And then hopefully releasing that ASAP for the industry. So if you're interested in that, I'd love to hear from you as well. We're trying to get as many inputs as possible before releasing that out. But that's just something that is really practical that we have to do, that enables everybody else to do the job that they have to do.
Yeah, yes, there's still quite a lot to do, isn't there? Matt, just to you then. So what have you been hearing the last hour, and what you could be taking forward?
Yeah, I think two things. One, I was really pleasantly surprised about the number of questions from the audience about farmers. It's sometimes, I think it's wonderful to see the questions, ensuring that we're thinking about the value back to farmers and that we have the appropriate protections and controls. That's really heartening to see. And then I would say, we were touching on this a bit before we started the webinar, but I think the hundreds of folks that signed up and joined, it shows that this topic has really become mainstream, and it's moved out of sort of small sustainability teams and into core elements of how companies are operating in a you know, sort of table stakes expectation, which I think is a really, really good thing for the industry and as a whole.
Great. Well, look, we're out of time, I'm afraid. Thanks so much to our panelists for their time today and their insight and their candor and answering the questions so openly. Thank you very much indeed. And thanks to you all for your questions. Some really, really interesting questions, as Matt alluded to. What we talked about today will, of course, be covered in more detail at the Innovation Forum Future of Food next week in Minneapolis on the 29th and 30th of May. Among those joining us will be representatives from Cargill and Tract. I'm looking forward to that trip very much. Full details about that on the Innovation Forum website. As I said earlier, we'll be in touch in the next few days to share the audio and video recordings of this webinar so you can watch again or forward to your colleagues. And thanks again to Cargill for supporting this session. But for now, I hope it's been an interesting hour for you. I've been Ian Welsh, and thanks for your attention.